Hi, welcome back to the channel. This video is an update on the situation in Ukraine. We've seen footage today that Russia has now started its invasion of Ukraine, and I wanted to go through all of the key points in terms of how this will impact on the global economy, because this isn't going to be contained just to Russia and Ukraine. This will have a massive implication for the global markets. We're already seeing the stock market starting to tumble. We've seen oil prices go up above $100 for the first time in a long time, and it's likely that this war is going to go on for some time. Ukraine is not happy about being invaded. It will fight back, and it's likely that this is going to be a long, drawn-out conflict, and that will have a big impact economically on the whole of the world. So in this video, I wanted to run through what the rest of the world are doing about this, what sanctions have been imposed so far and what the implications of those sanctions are, what the likely counter-sanctions will be from Russia's perspective, and then finally I'll wrap up with my view as to whether or not I think this is going to lead to a potential global recession. So before we get into all of that, if I could ask you to give me a thumbs up at some point during this video if you're enjoying the content, and please subscribe if you haven't done so already. And don't forget that I always include chapters in my videos, so if there's a particular section you're not that interested in, it's really easy to skip over it and move on to the next. So you may be sitting in your house somewhere in the world thinking, I don't really care about Russia or Ukraine, it has no relevance to me, it's thousands of miles away, it's not going to impact on my daily life. But unfortunately that's not right, because as you'll know if you watch this channel on a regular basis, the whole of the global economy is now interconnected. So what happens somewhere thousands of miles away from where you live can actually have a direct impact on everything that you do. Russia is a very big country and has a lot of natural resources and is one of the major suppliers of oil, natural gas and coal to a lot of countries around the world. It also exports a lot of agricultural products, and it has large reserves of specialist metals such as gold and platinum. Now, the news of this invasion this morning has already caused the stock markets to come crashing down, and it's sent the oil price through the roof. Oil is now trading above $100 per barrel, which is the first time that we've seen it hit that level since 2014, which not coincidentally was when Russia invaded Ukraine last time. So the last time that this happened, it had a massive spike effect on oil prices, and that's likely to happen again. And if this conflict goes on for some period of time, and it's likely to, because Ukraine is not happy about this invasion, they are going to fight back. So this is going to be a war. It's not going to just be a quick invasion as it was in 2014. Then we're going to see a prolonged period where oil prices are high, and unfortunately the Western world is dependent upon oil still. So most people are using it for their vehicles, but also a lot of industry uses oil, and a lot of power stations use oil and coal, and Russia is a big exporter of coal and natural gas, which is also used to produce electricity. So the fact that Russia, as one of the major exporters of energy products, is now entering into a conflict means that sanctions are likely to be imposed against Russia, so that could potentially limit the amount of natural resources that are available to a lot of countries, which will automatically push the price up, because when supply becomes limited and you have strong demand, it always increases prices. So if we see an increase in energy costs, which is very likely, then we will then see an increase in all costs. And at the moment, we've got extremely high levels of inflation all across the world. So the last thing that we need right now is an increase in energy costs, because that's going to push up prices even further. So potentially this will send inflation skyrocketing. So you may be sitting thousands of miles away from the Ukraine thinking it doesn't impact on me, but it will, because prices are definitely starting to go up already and are likely to continue going up whilst this conflict is in place, and could even go on for a number of years, because the sanctions that will be introduced against Russia could be long-standing. These sanctions may be put in place for years, not just a few weeks or a few months. So this is going to have an impact on everybody all around the world. So you may have heard the word sanctions being bandied around a lot about Russia and what's going to happen, and I wanted to just explain exactly what sanctions are. So sanctions were brought in 2014, the last time Russia invaded Ukraine, and sanctions are designed to hurt Russia. So the USA announced it was going to impose sanctions, and a lot of countries all around the world followed suit. So the initial sanctions that were introduced back in 2014 were travel bans on key individuals from Russia. So there was a list of named important Russian individuals who were unable to travel to the US, and then we saw similar bans brought in by the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Australia, and the majority of European countries. Those travel bans were followed up by business bans. So certain individuals and certain companies from Russia were also banned in terms of doing any trade. And the companies that were identified were companies that were helping to fund the war. So there were a number of banks that were identified, and there were also technology companies who were involved in the production of military weapons, as well as a number of energy businesses. The final set of restrictions that were imposed in terms of the sanctions back in 2014-2015 were a restriction on the ability of Russia to be able to raise debt in the international markets. So as you'll know if you follow the channel, a lot of countries around the world raise bonds to fund various investment and infrastructure, and they raise that from all across the world. So the fact that these sanctions were brought in meant that Russia was unable to access the capital markets, and therefore it was going to be more difficult to keep funding its military action. So they were the sanctions that were introduced in 2014-2015. And the impact of that at the time on Russia was that it created a recession in the country, and the value of the Russian ruble fell significantly in the international markets. The Russian central bank decided not to keep supporting the value of the ruble, and we saw the currency crash. So a lot of the sanctions that were imposed in 2014-2015 still exist. There are still a lot of travel bans, and still some of those companies are banned from doing any trade outside of Russia. And it's just been announced that new sanctions will be imposed against Russia with immediate effect. And the new sanctions are a step up compared to what we had previously. So we're now looking at more banks being blocked who won't be able to actually do any international business. We're seeing assets being frozen of overseas corporates and key individuals from Russia. And the international debt markets have been completely closed to Russia. So that means they won't be able to raise any new bonds, but also any existing bonds. There is no secondary market whatsoever for that. The impact of these new sanctions has already started to be felt in Russia, and the Russian stock market has fallen 50% in the last 5 days. In response to the sanctions that were brought in against Russia, Russia announced its own series of counter-sanctions. So it stated that it was no longer going to import any products from any of the countries that were imposing sanctions against it. Now, Russia is a big country and has a population of 144 million. So it imports a lot of food and other products from all around the world. So imposing sanctions does have an international impact, but it also has an impact in Russia as well. Because the reason that it's importing goods is either because it doesn't have those goods and therefore it needs to import them, or they're being produced for a lower cost in other countries around the world. So although the counter-sanctions were designed to hurt other economies, they also hurt the Russian economy because all countries need to import certain goods and products. We haven't heard yet of any new counter-sanctions, but I think it's very likely that President Putin will come out and announce a similar set of counter-sanctions than we saw in 2014-2015. So what are the implications of these sanctions on the global economy? Well, there were a number of studies that were done after the 2014-2015 sanctions were first introduced, and a major UK think tank operation called the Bow Group estimated that the impact on the Western economy was a loss of $700 billion. As another example, in 2015, ExxonMobil announced that it had lost $1 billion of trade due to the Russian sanctions, and the UN-sponsored review in 2017 estimated that most European countries were losing around $3 billion per month because of these restrictions. The counter-sanctions also had a direct negative impact on a lot of countries, and at the time that they were brought in, EU exports of agricultural products equated to $11.8 billion per year. The USA was exporting $1 billion per year of food products, Canada was exporting $500 million, and Australia was exporting $200 million. So all of that trade was wiped out immediately when Russia brought in its counter-sanctions. Between 2013 and 2018, Russian imports of food fell from 35% to 20%. And the flip side of that was that prices increased dramatically in Russia. So it's likely that we're going to see very similar impacts right now, but potentially it could be much worse because the profile of this invasion and the level of potential conflict is much greater than it was for the 2014 Crimea annexation. So what are the chances of this conflict leading directly to a new global financial crisis? Well, I think there is a real chance that this could trigger a global recession. We've already got a lot of countries who have extremely high levels of inflation, and the areas that are particularly under pressure are food and energy. So food and energy prices have been rising dramatically. We've seen a lot of countries around the world starting to increase interest rates to try to bring those prices back down. But unfortunately, a lot of those prices are driven by external factors. A lot of people import energy and food. So if we now see huge sanctions brought in against Russia, which is one of the major exporters of energy all around the world, they own a lot of oil, coal and natural gas. If everybody is banned from buying all of that, then the market is going to skyrocket. We're going to see prices going up dramatically. We could see oil going up closer to $200 a barrel if nobody is allowed to buy Russian oil. And we've also got a major problem in certain countries around the world who are dependent upon Russia for natural gas. So in Europe, Russia have laid a variety of pipelines that supply gas directly to certain countries. And the three main countries that are dependent upon Russian gas are Turkey, Germany and Italy. And that gas is being used to create electricity. So we've got gas-powered power stations in all of those countries. So if they have to switch off that supply of gas overnight, that means that they won't be able to carry on producing their electricity. Now that electricity is obviously being used by households, but it's also being used by industry. And the natural gas is also being used by industry directly. So if all of these countries have to stop using Russian energy, it's going to cause a massive problem. It's not just the fact that the price will go up, which will have a domino effect on prices globally, but it's also a supply issue. It's not easy to replace Russian energy overnight. It's really difficult. If you're having to switch off these pipelines and not take in the natural gas, you'll have to get liquefied natural gas from elsewhere. And there just isn't enough globally to be able to satisfy that demand. So we're definitely going to see a rise in energy costs. And a rise in energy costs means a rise in all costs, because all producers and manufacturers have to use energy in their processes. So as their costs increase, then they will have to increase the price of their goods. So this conflict is going to have a direct impact on global inflation. Prices are going to keep rising, and that is bad news for the global economy. And food prices will also keep rising because Russia is a major exporter of cereals and grain, as is Ukraine. So once you take out some supply from the global supply chain, then that is also going to drive up prices. But it's not just about prices and inflation. We are potentially also going to see shortages. So if we have to cut off all of the supplies from Russia, then that is going to leave empty shelves and potentially leave people without enough energy. And when you have shortages, that then means that companies have to stop producing and therefore means people won't be paid. So you'll have a fall in wages. So hopefully you can start understanding the pattern as to why all of this could have an impact on that global economy. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is bad news for everybody. It's obviously bad news if you live in Ukraine because you're now under attack. And there will be military conflict and there will be loss of life, unfortunately. But the economic impact of this invasion is going to be felt all around the world. The sanctions are already being stepped up against Russia, so they no longer have access to capital markets. Some of their companies will be restricted in terms of what trade they can do, and we're already seeing a major fall in Russian stock markets, and the Russian ruble has started to fall further against the US dollar. So although the sanctions have been designed to hurt Russia, they will also hurt the rest of the world. We're already seeing the oil prices starting to rise dramatically, and that's going to increase prices all across the globe. We're also seeing food prices starting to go up, and we will see a knock-on impact in inflation in all countries. And inflation was the one thing that everybody's trying to target. And the only way to bring inflation down is to push interest rates up. So we may well see an acceleration in interest rate increases in all of the Western world, and that is going to increase borrowing costs and therefore put more pressure on companies and households at a time when energy costs are continuing to go up and food prices will continue to go up further. And because energy prices are going up, that will drive up prices of all other goods because energy is used in the production of everything. So this is all bad news, and we've been sitting on the precipice of a global recession for some time now. We've been waiting for the impact of COVID and all of the other things that have been going on for the last few years to start to have a real impact. And I think there is a real potential here that this military conflict could be the Black Swan event that we've been waiting for that will trigger a new global financial crisis. This military conflict is not going to be over in a matter of days. It's likely to go on for weeks, possibly months. And the sanctions that are introduced against Russia are likely to be in place for a number of years. So that is going to increase prices and really hurt the global economy. So unfortunately, I do think that there is a real possibility here that this war could cause all of us to go into a deep recession. I'll keep you posted on any further news, events and developments. If you've liked what I've said today, then please give me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already.